I bet that you are finding that any type of communication with your teen is almost impossible right now. Both Joel and I tried hard to be great parents to our children, but we certainly didn't have anyone or any book tell us what to do when our teenage boys started using drugs. Trying to communicate with our sons was almost impossible, mostly because we just didn't have the tools for positive communication. Just like us, parents tell us all the time that they really struggle with, "What do I say?" When you are facing a problem of this magnitude, communication can turn negative in a hurry. A lot of times there's just the fear that you'll say the wrong thing, only causing the situation to exacerbate. Then you get angry and frustrated when the situation only worsens when you try to talk to your child. But we have to acknowledge that anytime drugs and alcohol enters the family, it's usually a recipe for very poor communication. In this segment, we want to spend some time presenting some ways to communicate when you might be asking, "What do I say?" First, I had to learn to get past the fear that I might say something that I thought caused the situation to get worse. Like Joel, I had to learn some effective communication tools that could help alleviate those feelings of maybe being afraid, nervous, helpless, or angry. There are definitely some ways of communicating that produce better outcomes than you might expect or have experienced. Let's see if we can make your communication easier and effective. Overall, we want to focus on practicing some positive communication. Trust me, it can be the most powerful tool or skill that you can learn to use. But first, let's take a look at what's not working. Major stress on families usually results in mostly nagging, endless threats, and constant lecturing, which you have already said leaves you feeling exhausted, frustrated, and angry. Communication becomes so strained that it's almost non-existent. That's because this type of communication is negative and usually leads to making things even worse. All the while, your teenager is probably withdrawing more and more from the family unit. So you need to be willing to try a different approach. And let's start by looking at some positive communication skills. Listen to your teen as much as you talk. Good communication starts with listening, not listening for the purpose of giving advice, just simply listening. Your son or daughter is more likely to confide in you about what is really going on if you listen without interrupting or criticizing. During the early days of my son's drug treatment, I was taught to respond with sounds of response or simply some short responses. Things like, "Oh, wow, that's a bummer, glad to hear it." And if I felt that I really needed to express my disagreement, I was told that I could say something like, "Really? This kind of communication takes practice and is very helpful when a discussion with your teen is just not working. And yes, of course, there are times when more response is needed. But when we practice listening, really listening, we open the door to real communication. You might be thinking now, "But I can't even trust my teenager anymore. They're just lying just to get anything they want." I know. We are not suggesting that you become stupid and gullible, believing everything that they say, because most of the time they can be quite manipulative. We're just suggesting that if you practice listening in a different way, you open up the door for them to interact with you differently. A common pitfall in listening is the temptation to start mentally preparing your own response while your son or daughter is talking to you. Generally, it's because you want to be sure that your words of wisdom are being heard and understood. However, when we do that, we are really only half listening. Our teen and others will notice that you're being less receptive and the communication begins to break down. If you want others to listen when you speak, you must learn to listen when they speak. Those face-to-face conversations are where we can learn much more about what is going on. Remember, real communication is a two-way system. So this is when active listening can be an important skill to use. As a teacher and a counselor, I became familiar with and often used active listening skills in my work. What I learned when facing my son's struggles with drugs is that I needed to apply those skills more than ever in our home. By actively listening, you send the message that they are important enough to have your undivided attention. You might not be familiar with the concept of active listening. In simple terms, it means that you fully concentrate, understand, and respond to what is being said instead of being distracted. Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits of People, said it very well. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. When a parent is an active listener, it pulls out more of the information that you are seeking to find. Then you are better able to guide your teen to deal with and solve problems for themselves. Genuine understanding helps reduce defensiveness and promotes empathy toward your teen's situation. It doesn't mean that you agree with him or her or even like what they're doing, but it does show that you are at least understanding it or some of it. Using understanding statements shows your teen that you recognize their emotions, actions, or reactions, and that you do understand. For example, I know it can be hard to leave a party earlier than your friends. Another way to listen with understanding is to use open-ended questions such as, "How can I help you?" instead of just saying, "Do you need help?" This offer of help also lets your teen know that you are willing to collaborate on a solution. When you offer help in a non-judgmental way and with a sense of understanding, you are planting the seed that help is needed in that situation. We've already mentioned that yelling and screaming or speaking in a critical tone really doesn't work. Threatening or lecturing typically leads to your teen withdrawing, sneaking around, or lying. It is so much more important to stay calm but direct about your boundaries in regards to drug and alcohol use and what the consequences are. When you want to prevent yourself from becoming involved in an argument, it is best to avoid trying to talk to your child when they are high or inebriated. Both my husband and I made that mistake several times. It's much better to take a break, cool off, and return to the conversation later on. When you're angry or nervous, you often end up saying more than is necessary, and your teen gets very defensive. Before long, negative communication takes over. Instead, think ahead of time about what you want to say and be concise. Less gets you more. Also, be specific, because vague requests are often ignored or misunderstood. Instead of saying, It wouldn't kill you to get your clothes up off the floor. Specify how you want your teen to help. It would really take some pressure off of me if you would put your dirty clothes in the hamper each morning. Using I statements gives you a model of communication that can be achieved in 3 parts. First, report your feeling in just 3 words. I feel sad, angry, hurt, scared, frustrated. Choose the feeling that describes your emotion. Then, fill in with what you think is creating that feeling. For example, I feel scared when you come home past your curfew. I can't stop all those terrible scenarios from running through my head. As opposed to saying something like this, you are so disrespectful when you think you can come in here anytime you want. Do you have any idea what you're putting me through? This way of communicating really does decrease the chance of your teen getting so defensive. Using I statements keeps the focus on you and stops you from making accusations. You're also concentrating on how you feel instead of your teen's behavior. It's not uncommon to feel like you're walking on eggshells trying to avoid any confrontation, or perhaps you're just too scared to face the facts about what's happening in your home. When this happens, usually there is little to no communication going on. Sometimes we spend a lot of time just dwelling on the problem without really ever verbalizing our thoughts. If this is the case, you might want to consider talking to a friend or someone who's not so close to the situation so that you can actually practice what you feel needs to be said. We've talked about seeking some professional help, so this may be a time to consider that action. Every parent struggles with communication when the problem of drugs and alcohol enters the home. It's easy to fall into communication traps of pleading, threatening, yelling, lecturing, and so on when trying to get our teen or young adult to change. Both research and experience shows without a doubt that this negative communication simply does not work. These forms of negative communication may have happened many times already in your home. They certainly did in mine. But with the stress and worry, you probably feel that you have lost control, and it's okay. I've yet to meet a family that hasn't experienced negative communication when confronted with a problem of this magnitude. Be patient with yourself as you are trying to learn and practice new ways of communicating or simply trying to remain calm amid the chaos. Remember, your tone of voice is actually more important than what you are saying. A gentle, neutral tone increases the chances that your teen is actually listening. If your tone is good, sometimes it really won't matter if you're saying the right thing. For some, this is one of the hardest parts of positive communication to master. Changing the way you communicate will take practice, but these positive communication skills will improve your interactions with everyone, not just your teen. I've said it in other segments, but it's so important that I must say it again now. Positive communication comes easier when you are taking care of you. Getting rest, exercising, eating well, meditation, or prayer all contribute to your ability to be a good communicator. If you keep on doing what you've always done, communication is likely not to get any better. You have to establish some positive communication to open the door to helping your son or daughter. Substance abuse is a serious problem, So we hope that you are willing to try a different approach to communicating with your teen.